Joseph Abbeel's memoir offers a riveting glimpse into the life of a Flemish light horseman conscripted into Napoleon's Grand Armée. His vivid recounting of the Napoleonic Wars, from personal hardships to battlefield experiences, highlights the resilience and humanity of a soldier amid the era's epic turmoil. This is the 6th episode. We find Abbeel near Smolensk. Let's begin. When the city was finally in our hands, we immediately received orders to pursue the enemy. As it was getting dark, we spent the night 2 hours from the city in a mountainous, or rather ravine-like, and barren region, unaware that we were very close to the enemy. There was no food available for us or our horses, as there were no fields or meadows. The next day we set out at 4 in the morning, and to our surprise, we encountered the enemy army just an hour away from our bivouac. The enemy was positioned between forests and ravines. Ravines are wide dry ditches that cut through forests. As we approached the enemy, the infantry was positioned in front because there was no room for cavalry to charge. Like hunters, these infantrymen spread out into the forests and soon became engaged in a bloody battle. Indeed, the enemy had positioned themselves on the heights along the ravines and resolutely awaited our soldiers. But our men bravely advanced up the slope with bayonets, shouting, "Have courage, my friends, kill those scoundrels." Courage was immense on both sides, and fierce fighting ensued, with many brave soldiers quickly falling or bleeding to death. Yes, in both camps, the cry was, "No mercy, for anyone." For this reason, few soldiers were wounded here, while many fell. In less than an hour, blood flowed down the slopes and the dead lay piled on top of each other. Due to the enemy's good position, it was mostly our soldiers who fell. The battle lasted until noon without either side gaining ground, but then we gained the upper hand and the enemy fled. We held the battlefield, albeit with a great loss of manpower. The Battle of Smolensk was not as long as this one. It was reported here that there were 15,000 dead, not counting the wounded. We did not take the time to bury the dead but rode horses and cannons over the many corpses that lay on the roads. The corpses were so crushed that when I saw them later on the return journey from Moscow, they no longer seemed to have a human form. Also, not one had been buried since the battles near Smolensk. This will be read further on. We continuously pursued the enemy and fought whenever we encountered their rearguard. But the Russian troops always moved further and further away, taking along everything and everyone, including peasants, women, children, livestock, and other items. We bravely chased them without being able to catch up until we finally found them on a plain 3 to 4 hours from Minsk, where they awaited us. There we engaged in a fierce fight with the Russian cavalry, resulting in much bloodshed. We captured several cannons, transport wagons, and ammunition, while the field was littered with dead enemies. Nonetheless, we also lost many soldiers, especially from the 2nd Regiment of Lancers. I came out of the battle unharmed but lost my horse, which was hit by a cannonball in the belly. After the victory was secured, I received another horse from a rider who had been injured. It was a very good horse, but a bit hard in the mouth. We pursued the enemy until we reached Mogilansky. There, we positioned ourselves in the field because the enemy was in the city. I have decided to give a brief description of our journey from the camp at Oziaski. I think I will not bore the reader when I dwell briefly in the surroundings of Krasnoy to give a sketch of the difficulties we encountered there. After we had won all the battles described earlier, the great Alexander, Emperor of Russia, sent several negotiators daily to Napoleon to offer, so they told him, a favorable peace with the promise of large sums of money. But Napoleon, who did not conduct the war alone, also wanted to hear the opinions of his other commanders. They seemed more inclined to continue fighting than to make peace, with the exception of Marshal Ney. Ney candidly told our emperor that peace was necessary and also favorable for the entire army. This was not well received by the others, who were in the majority and did not want to know about a ceasefire. Murat led this party. He said to Napoleon, "Why should we make peace now? Are they not fleeing? The enemy will flee the world if we pursue them. Let us therefore make a favorable peace in the Tsar's palace after we have conquered Moscow. There is more honor to be gained than returning to our homeland now." Le Petit, who was also warlike, enjoyed the words of the King of Naples. Therefore, he disregarded Ney's good advice and sent the negotiators back empty-handed. After we left the camp at Oziaski, we traveled almost day and night, tormented by hunger and thirst. When the weather was bad, we rode through the mud, and when it was good, the dust rose to our throats. The movement of horses and men raised large clouds of dust. We had our eyes and mouths so full of it that we could barely see each other and hardly open our eyes. Often we blindly attacked the enemy, hacking and slashing with our sabers, even though we were not yet near him. Only when we were halfway did we realize he was there. Burned by the sun and black as devils, we continued our journey, unable to find water to refresh ourselves or our horses or to wash. We had no time to change our clothes, for we departed at 2 or 3 in the morning and rode until 10 or 11 at night, almost without stopping or dismounting, except to relieve ourselves. When we stopped briefly along the way, everyone, both officers and soldiers, loosened their belts and vests to catch the lice and fleas that had multiplied in our dirty upper and underclothes. When we put our hands in our shirts, we pulled out a handful of lice and fleas. We threw them on the ground without first killing them. Indeed, we were infested everywhere, even in the bottom of our trousers, where they bothered and bit us the most. Because we had not taken off our boots for 6 months, day or night, those creatures constantly sucked the blood from our legs, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. Meanwhile, our clothes were worn out and winter was approaching, but in this distant land, there was no way to get new clothes. We were constantly outside, in the mud and muck. We could not close our eyes for a moment. When we bivouacked, we were forced to walk 3 to 4 hours in the dark through the forest to find food in villages, risking falling into the hands of peasants or the enemy, after which we often, after a long walk, returned empty-handed. At other times, we found a lot of loot and returned loaded like pack mules to our overnight camp, only to find no one there, so we were forced to catch up with our comrades on foot by following their tracks. We often went several days without bread or drink. When we found grain, we had to grind it with querns or hand mills and make bread without leaven. In short, we had to travel all day and work all night, and often we were not allowed to sleep for more than an hour a week. We often had to fight, patrol, and stand guard. There was nothing to be found in the villages, and we had to look for peasants who had fled to the forests. The water for us and for our horses had to be fetched an hour away, and the wells we found were often filled with manure and other filth. Pots and other objects we could use were destroyed. The villages were partially or completely burned down, and there were no inhabitants to be seen. Often we had grain, but no mills to grind it, or we had flour, but no ovens to bake it. Or we had meat, but no pans and salt to cook it. In short, something was always missing. However, we made do with whatever we could get, and sometimes we had a good day, but that happened rarely, for the enemy and the peasants had taken everything that could have served us. And what they could not take, they smashed. Even the wells were made unusable, as I have just described. Even the grain would have been taken or burned if they had suspected that we would learn to grind it. But poverty makes one resourceful. From soldiers, we became millers, bakers, butchers, and other craftsmen. In short, we did everything we could to stay alive, even though it involved great danger and suffering, which is indescribable and seems unbelievable to those who did not experience this sad and miserable campaign. Through everything we experienced and because we found murdered comrades daily, whenever we were on a plundering expedition, we set fire to everything in our path. Often one could see 11, 12 villages completely in flames. Where the army passed, nothing remained. But there are forests so vast that one could ride through them for 20, 30, 40 to 100 hours without encountering houses or people. In these forests, the bearded men who operated in front of and behind the army ambushed and killed several of our soldiers. Yes, these scoundrels, who knew the roads well, followed us closely and ambushed the plunderers at night when they returned from their expeditions. One morning, we found 12 cuirassiers from the 2nd Regiment who had been killed a quarter of an hour from our bivouac as they returned from a castle. That same night, I narrowly escaped that fate. 2 of us had gone to a village, half an hour from our bivouac, to bake bread. There were more of our soldiers there for the same reason. By chance, we found a peasant's house in the middle of the village with a good oven. While I was busily stoking the oven, my comrade went outside to fetch water. Suddenly, he heard shouts of hurrah, hurrah from all directions, after which he immediately warned me. We quickly jumped into the vegetable garden, which was full of hemp, and hid there. We knew no escape route, and we heard the Cossacks combing through the village from 2 sides simultaneously. They searched all the houses and killed everyone they found, as our soldiers had no weapons to defend themselves. When they reached our house, 3 of them entered. After searching everything, they mounted their horses and rode on. We remained under the hemp, more inclined to soil our trousers than to laugh, as we were nearly scared to death. As day broke and we heard and saw nothing more, we tentatively emerged from the hemp. Starving, we entered one house after another to see if we could find any bread in the ovens. In almost every house, we found murdered soldiers. Finally, we found an oven full of baked breads. On the floor were sacks next to the murdered soldiers, whom we recognized. We stuffed the breads into the sacks and took them with us. When we reached our bivouac, everyone was amazed to see us, as those who had managed to escape had already reported that all the soldiers in that village had been killed. A few days later, I went into the forests again to look for food, this time alone. I came across a house that stood alone and where I thought I might find something. I searched the house but found nothing, so I went to check the barn and stables. There, I found a dead hussar whose body was still warm. His completely bloodied saber lay a few steps from the body, which had more than 50 wounds. As far as I could tell, he had been killed with a pitchfork. I took the saber, as I had no weapons with me and was at risk of being attacked. Driven by hunger, I continued deeper into the forest to find a village, which I found after a mile. I searched house after house without seeing anyone, until I finally found 2 breads in an oven. Delighted, I took the breads out of the oven and was about to return to the regiment when, to my great surprise, a woman crawled out from under the oven with a small child in her arms. She stood before me and made gestures indicating that I should stab her and the child with the saber, because the bread I was clutching under my arm was the only food she had. This young creature, who had thrown herself at my feet, warmed my stony heart so much that I could do nothing but leave her the breads, even though I was starving. I must add that it would not have ended this way if it had been some werewolf of a Russian peasant, for I would have rather given him 1,000 saber cuts than give him a gram of that bread. And if a comrade had been with me, I would not have done it, for fear of being laughed at. But alone, I could make that decision freely, harming no one but myself. Hungry, I returned to the bivouac, telling no one about it. While such incidents and dangers were daily fare since our departure from the camp, we finally reached the aforementioned Krasnoy. From what I have described above, the reader can deduce what we suffered in this wilderness, but all that paled in comparison to the rest of the campaign and was hardly a foretaste of what was yet to come. When we arrived at Krasnoy early in the morning, we wanted to drive out the Russians to seize the supplies we so desperately needed and which were plentiful there. After much fighting, we succeeded, but when the enemy realized they would be defeated, they preferred to set the city on fire rather than let us have the loot. In this way, we were deprived of all hope of supplies. The enemy retreated to Mozhask, only 2 days' journey away, while we bivouacked in the vicinity of Krasnoy. Since we lacked supplies here, I was ordered, along with 12 others, to go foraging. There was an adjutant major with us, named Vilkem, the son of a prince, who despite his youthful age, was a bold and good soldier. Our group also included a sergeant who was not easily daunted. At dusk, we left our regiment and entered the woods, not knowing where to go. Having ridden and fought all day without eating, we were tired. After riding back and forth for a long time, we saw a beautiful castle with a village nearby at dawn, as we emerged from the woods. We thought we could make a lot of loot there, for, we said to each other, no one from our army had been there yet. In fact, we were not far from the army, even though we had ridden all night, because later we realized that we were at most 4 miles from Krasnoy. Indeed, when we arrived at the castle, we saw meadows full of cows and horses, as can only be seen in places where no looters had been. Undaunted, we rode into the castle, but the Baron, who had seen us coming, came to greet us swiftly. He suggested we put the horses in the stable so they could be better cared for. But the adjutant, who did not trust the cunning barons, dismounted and held our horses while forbidding us to get off. He went inside and immediately had food and drink brought to us, which we quickly devoured. Meanwhile, the adjutant, without eating or drinking, went to the cellar to check the supplies. The Baron had meanwhile sent one of his servants to the Cossacks, who were not far away, in the woods, to inform them of our arrival. Fortunately, we saw the dust clouds raised by their horses. We immediately called the adjutant, who quickly mounted his horse, and we rode as fast as the horses could run to the village. There, we formed a battle line and awaited the Cossacks resolutely. When they saw that we did not back down, even though they were at least 50 men, they dared not come closer to reflect themselves in our brass cuirasses. After shouting hurrah, hurrah a few times, they retreated like cowards into the woods. After the departure of these robbers, we remained in battle formation for a while. Our adjutant encouraged us by saying, "Friends, do not fear those bone stick carriers, they are poor soldiers. Even if they were 6 times as many, let us not flee before they have felt our sabers." We headed back to the castle to thank the Lord for the kindness he had shown us. But hardly had we reached the castle when that cursed rabble came riding towards us with a much larger group of scoundrels. When we saw them, we retreated to the village. But since we were only 13 against such a large number of enemies, many were struck with fear. To tell the truth, we had to be afraid, for 5 or 6 of our soldiers had horses that were not worth a pipe of tobacco. If it came to it, these riders stood no chance of escaping the enemy. Yes, it was obvious that we would stand no chance against such a force. I thought, we'll see what happens, because I trusted my horse, which had not yet let me down. Meanwhile, the bears were closing in, blocking off the terrain from all sides. Eventually, we were surrounded and caught like eels in a trap. However, we could tell from their stance that they did not dare to charge us, afraid as they were that our infantry might be hiding in the village. The attentive adjutant noticed that some of us were frightened. Therefore, he said, "Take heart, soldiers. Let's take up the saber to make the blood of these traitors flow, sparing no one. And if we are killed by them, we will die on the field of honor and will not be remembered as cowards in our villages." But when he saw that we were surrounded, he turned as pale as a corpse and shouted, "Attack that scum. We'll break through the encirclement." After that cry, we charged their cordon at full gallop, eliminating many of their poor riders. We lost 6 men, and 2 more were taken prisoner because their horses were not fast enough. I will tell more about them later. This concludes the 6th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes.